Okay, welcome to Skeptarchy. This is our first episode. I'm Corey Johnston, and my co-hosts are...
I am Kevin Watson.
And I'm Del on Earth.
All right, so I guess we're trying to do a critical thinking, progressive politics type show. Is that, I guess, what we're going to do here?
I mean, yeah, you came up with the idea for the name, so
yeah.
You know, I figured you had some sort of thing going for that in mind. But yeah, we've definitely got things we can talk about in the world, and it should be an interesting time.
So, should we say like where people might know us previously from at the start of the show or at the end of the show?
I mean, either way, like, I guess...
I think for the first show, maybe we should do it as sort of like just a little introduction of some kind, maybe, in the first
sounds like
one.
A good idea. Okay, who wants to go first, then?
Well, I can go first. So, I've been doing online, keyboard activism, as it were, for several years now in various fields, science communication, progressive/leftist politics, lately a little bit more of the anarchist skew. So, I've got a Facebook page that SJW, the Nazis warned you about. I've been on a couple of podcasts, including Corey's previous one, Brainstorm, as well as the Podunk it's Podunk. Oh, shoot, I forget what it was now. Oh, no, they're now called the Postmodern Polymaths podcast.
Right.
Chris Watson and Lyman Smith's podcast. So I've been on there a couple of times. Other than that, I don't have too much of presence. I just kind of do my thing.
Cool. You want to go next?
Sure. So I tried to do my own podcast called Evidence-Based Eating. I recorded a few episodes and published those. I haven't entirely given up on it in my head. It's just that the episodes require a lot of research, and I really don't want to get anything wrong. So I really crack the whip on myself to make sure I'm doing a lot of research ahead of time, and then I really just didn't feel very fulfilled and motivated podcasting by myself. Like, just talking to a microphone by myself in a room was just really hard to get excited about. So I'm really excited to be able to be a part of this, where maybe I can still share some of my thoughts and some of my perspective, and just a little bit more casual of an environment too.
I really liked your show, and I hope you do eventually get back to it. But I'm glad that you can be with us on this.
Maybe I'll get a little more. Maybe I'll get a little more into the habit of being in front of the mic.
Yeah, that's good. I'm a little bit out of practice myself. Brainstorm was my show, the Brainstorm podcast, and I guess I've been out of practice for about 2 years. I tried starting a show, The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, but then it didn't feel right. Something about it was like, I don't know, it wasn't the right fit for what I wanted to do with the show. So I'm glad that we're doing this, and I guess, we'll see how things go.
That's good.
Like I say, I am very out of practice. I used to be half good at this.
Only half?
Yeah, only half. I was never as professional as some others, but...
Yeah, I got so much positive feedback on my show that, like, I feel a little bad about not being able to keep up with it, but and I also kind of got, like, paralyzed by, like, there were so many things that I wanted to talk about that then I had trouble narrowing it down, and then, like, how much do you talk about in one episode and how much don't you, and it's so much to do, and if it's, like, even if you have one other person around to bounce stuff off of, I feel like it can really smooth things out. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I have almost like I don't know if you'd call it a research paralysis. I start, there's so much that I'd leave out if I'm researching a topic and just want to talk about something that I go, well, I mean, I don't actually have the time to do 10 years worth of research on this subject, but I still want to share some knowledge with people and try and get some information out there, but.
Yeah, see, the reason I do most of my activism online is because usually in conversation you can, pick on specific points that you want to talk about and research those, and if that requires specific facts, you can source those. But overall, it's a more direct way versus where if you're just kind of talking into the void, it gets very nebulous and your mind can go all over the place, and you can just end up with with 3 hours of talking about a single topic, and you don't really know where you wanted to go with that. So I do think that talking with another person or 2 or 3 can be really helpful in that regard, because you can just kind of play off each other's strengths and just have that conversational vibe.
And it's like one of those long Facebook posts, and at the end you're like, I don't really know what the point of this is. I just typed for 2 hours on this. It didn't have a point, but
sometimes you just need to get stuff off your chest.
Yeah. So who wants to cover we each got a topic or kind of a few articles regarding something. Who wants to go first?
Well, I guess I can go first. So this week I wanted to talk about a man named David Graeber. Some people might know who he is. I really hadn't heard of him before a few days ago, and the more I looked into him, the more I realized kind of how influential he was, specifically in the worlds of both science and kind of political analysis. He was a big proponent of anarchism after having studied a number of societies, generally, societies which hadn't become part of the more globalized world. So talking native peoples in South America and around the world. One of the big things he's probably known for is that he was a huge influential voice in the whole Occupy Wall Street movement about 10 years ago, to the point where some people actually think he coined the phrase, "We are the 99%." It's been really interesting because he's had this huge long life in academia and in just writing about his experiences and his analyses. I've seen a huge outpouring of kind of, I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for is, but just commemoration of him and his work in the leftist community over the last few days. And I think he's a really interesting person to talk about because he wrote on various topics regarding capitalism, hierarchy, government, as well as just being an anthropologist and looking at the history of the world's societies. He has been vocal in everything from criticizing capitalism to talking about things like anti-Semitism and other forms of racism and bigotry. He's done a number of interviews over the years where he took the time to really talk about all of those things. I watched a 20-minute interview of him with what is his name? Charlie Rose, that he did some years ago. And it was really interesting to see kind of his perspective and the way he voiced it because, I had an idea that he was an influential thinker in the world of anarchist theory, but the way he talked about it was unlike almost anyone I'd seen up to that point, where he has the perspective of it being something you do rather than something you are. And I think that's a really interesting perspective because the idea of anarchism being, that any hierarchies in our society need to justify themselves and that, no person or group should have any power over any other person or group that they don't consent to. And he was talking about it more as things that you do to fight against the existing hierarchies. And so it was really interesting to just kind of dig into his philosophy and find those little nuggets of interesting thought where, like I said, it's not something I had previously thought of in that way.
Yeah, I have to say, I don't know that I've heard of him before, but I must not be in the same circles because I didn't see anything about him recently either. I mean, and you're saying you became aware of him because you were seeing all about him.
His name is really well known through like far leftist circles. And like there were a number of articles even in like mainstream news, New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, etc., that all kind of covered him and covered, what he did, who he was, what he said, etc. So it was really interesting to kind of find out how all of these different, sources viewed, how he looked. So you have the more kind of mainstream corporatist media that really focused more on his, his scholarly work and, would put a few mentions of, things that he did, like Occupy Wall Street, where he was a big figure. But, it was largely more about his scholarly career, whereas then you look at the more leftist figures, Jacobin, the New Republic, etc. And they all kind of talk more about his activist work and the kinds of things that he talked about in terms of criticizing, economists and various, banking systems, etc., and just kind of giving all of these different perspectives on how, how capitalism has changed kind of the fundamental nature of who we are as humans to the point where, there are a lot of societies where you will find cooperation is a lot more prominent than it is under most liberal capitalist societies that we see today. And so that's one of the things that I think really struck me as interesting is just that comparison and the fact that, one of the biggest criticisms I hear of anarchism is that, it goes against human nature, and he's provided at least some evidence that no, maybe it hasn't. Maybe, things like cooperation and mutual aid and solidarity with one another are the, evolutionarily the more quote unquote natural ways to be, as opposed to this kind of hyper competitive society that we've built under the capitalist system.
Yeah,
it pervades everything. Like the systems that you are raised in those ways, they pervade everything. So trying to, without looking at things outside the capitalist system, how would you even be able to say anything?
Exactly. And like it's one of those things where when you declare something as human nature, when you've only ever been exposed to people within a particular system where those traits are the most beneficial, you essentially have a form of confirmation bias. It's or maybe not confirmation bias, but selection bias, where you are only seeing the evidence of the thing that you believe, and thus that reinforces it. And when you look outside that system and look at it with a critical eye, you can see that maybe this is not as inevitable as people think it is.
Is that I've heard very smart people use this word, but is that what they call hegemony, like the dominant hegemony?
So hegemony is the concept there is essentially, the dominant ideology of a particular society. There's what you'll hear in a lot of leftist circles is more along the lines of like American imperialist hegemony, and basically, you take the kind of conditions that capitalism and colonialism have placed on the world over the last several centuries, and kind of you end up with a certain state of the world, and in our current state of the world, or at least until fairly recently, America was seen as the kind of leader of the free world. That is to say that, like, even outside the U.S., the president of the United States is often, called the leader of the free world. And so that's largely because, mainly after World War II, the U.S. manufacturing giant was in full swing while all these other countries were kind of recovering. And so we took manufacturing dominance, and then once manufacturing in other countries started to scale up, and a lot of that production was offshored from the U.S. to other places, we kind of took over as the economic center of the world, to the point where, 90-some% of global commerce happens in the U.S. dollar. And so, we have, probably the largest entertainment industry, for a country in the world, to the point where, we pump out the vast majority of, entertainment, and then it's translated into other languages. But, people all over the world know what Disney is, know what Marvel is, know what all of these, big media ideas is, and they all come from the U.S. And so in that way, we've not only exported, various economic goods and services, but also kind of our entire culture. You will, I think, find when people from outside the U.S. come here, they will end up being, maybe less surprised about, how the culture here is than if you reverse that.
Yeah, totally.
So yeah, the U.S. hegemony is very prevalent in our society, and that's largely due to capitalism and largely due to the influence that we have had over the rest of the world through that system, and to the point where, the dominant ideology is of the world is not just capitalism, but in many ways U.S. capitalism.
Back to David Graeber for a minute. I don't know, did you mention his book?
Yeah. So I actually, he's had several books. One of the most kind of influential was a book called Bullshit Jobs. I haven't read it myself, but as I understand the premise, and this is something, there was a quote I remember from a long time ago. I wish I could remember more of it, but it was essentially the idea that the majority of jobs that you see in kind of the quote unquote white collar world are largely bullshit. Like, they're not needed for for a productive, world to exist. And when I think about this myself, I often think of things like sales and marketing. Those only exist in large part because of the need for companies to explode their reach and be able to get to as many people as possible. And usually this is dominated by these big corporations. And it's essentially the idea that in order to make a profit, you have to have a customer base. And for the last 100 years, in order to have a customer base, you had to be able to market, and you had to proactively reach out to people. And so you end up with all of these jobs involving sales and advertising and all these things that, strictly speaking, are completely pointless. Like, what they're selling is often useful, and, there may be a case for them to exist on a much smaller scale. But personally, I think the vast majority of these jobs are just completely pointless and don't really have a purpose in supplying the needs that people actually have.
And in my experience, like, even if they're not completely pointless, like, the actual amount of, like, they're mostly filler. Like, there'll be like 2 or 3 hours of necessary work that gets done. Like, I recently got promoted within the same company, and I went from doing like actual physical labor, like probably 30 hours of my 40-hour work week were like doing actual physical work, like with my hands, right? And now I got promoted, and like I make $12,000 a year more, and I do nothing. Like, Like, and part of that is because, like, I'm new and so I don't have a full workload yet, and we're all working from home, and, like, it's very weird to start a job in the middle of a pandemic with people you've never met before, but, like, legitimately, like, I could easily do, like, the actual work I need to do most weeks in, like, 4 to 8 hours. Easily. And it's just so wrong that, like, oh yeah, well now you make more money and nobody watches over your shoulder and nobody cares about this or that and it's a more prestigious position and this is the position that required my college degrees and it's just like, this is so wrong. It's just messed up.
And so, you know, this is a phenomenon that's actually been known about for over a century. There was a scholar and an anarchist theorist named Peter Kropotkin. He was a Russian scholar who had been exiled, during Tsarist Russia, and had written multiple treatises about, you know, the economics of communism. And Peter Kropotkin had written a number of essays and books, and eventually he wrote a book called The Conquest of Bread when he was living in France. And in the book, he described essentially his ideal of an anarchist communist society. And one of the points he was very careful to make was to point out that even 100 years ago plus, it was possible for all of the necessary work that needed to be done within a society to be done within 16 to 20 hours per week from each worker. And so, and this was at a time well before the 40-hour work week was established as kind of the common thing.
Well, and I'm sure with modern technology, that's probably infinitesimally smaller now.
Yeah. And so statistically, you know, and the US at least has numbers on this that show that, you know, since 1970, the productivity per worker has gone up several times, like 5 or 6 times over. And that the wages, the average wages over that same period have remained largely stagnant. But I think that goes to show that all of the technological advances made in the last 120 years and, you know, in the last, you know, 50 to 60 specifically have really exploded our ability to produce. But, you know, I don't think the population, the need of the people has gone up nearly as much. And so we've actually entered into a phase of massive overproduction. And that's one of the major reasons for the climate issues we're facing and we have been facing for the last 40, 50 years is because we are producing so much largely because of this ethos of infinite growth that, you know, right. Our society and our economic system is constantly under, and it, you know, reminds me of an old sales manager who worked at a company I was working for. He would always say "up and to the right," referring to like the revenue graph. You know, it's always going up and to the right, and like the idea being you always want to see that arrow growing and that revenue growing, and like basic thermodynamics tells us that can't happen. So, you know, we are constantly looking for more and more ways to create more and more stuff for people to consume. But, you know, we're getting to a point where it's just too much. You know, we have more crap in landfills and in the ocean and in our atmosphere that people just threw away or used willy-nilly and then, you know, threw out. The fact that we've got, you know, disposable everything these days, you know, it's just one more of these.
I think that's like totally an example of what you were talking about with the hegemony, though, is like, I feel like our culture has internalized everything going up and to the right at all times. Yeah. And like, I read something, so one of my degrees is in philosophy. I still feel like I'm a total noob at philosophy because, like, studying philosophy for a couple years tells you, like, 2% of all the philosophy in the world. So,
just going to do a quick shout out on a wonderful YouTube channel I watch a lot called Philosophy Tube. If you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I should probably get into YouTube now that I have a desk job. I was a 100% podcast guy for a long time because I could never be anywhere near a computer, so I was never on YouTube. But anyway, I was reading at one point about how, like, historically, talking like in the times of the ancient Greeks, everyone knew that time was a circle and that everything you did was a circle. Like everything progressed in a circle, right? It was all cycles. And like we completely think of everything that we think about today as being a line going one direction. Like that's how we think about everything in our lives, is a line going one direction, right? And like even like when you take cultural sort of thoughts and you break them down to like their most basic tenets, that's the kind of differences that you get that just affect the way you think about everything. So like I feel like it would be so hard to convince people in this modern society to not want growth all the time, because we just can't not need improvement. Like that's just not how the world works to us. You know what I'm saying? Like it's just so deep and it's so embedded, and it's like if you don't spend any time like looking outside your bubble or thinking about other things or the way other people think, you never even realize there's a different way of thinking about the world, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And like we have been kind of seduced into this consumerist mindset, and like people who criticize consumerism often, you know, I feel like they're getting close to the point, but often missing it because they're not seeing the kind of underlying capitalist, you know, forces behind it. Marx had a specific term for it called commodity fetishism. Basically, we fetishize the idea of getting more and more stuff. You know, the old keeping up with the Joneses metaphor. You know, that kind of comes right along with the whole American dream. It's, you know, the idea that you need to be buying constantly the newest and the best stuff. And, you know, we can see that in things like designed obsolescence and the fact that there's a new iPhone every half a year, and, you know, that you're constantly told you must buy this. And it's, you know, it's a force that has driven people into massive amounts of credit card debt because, you know, they have these competing ideals in their head of, oh, you need to be better with your money, but also consume all this stuff, but be better with your money, but consume all this stuff. And it's these inherently conflicting ideas within the concept of capitalism where, you know, you are told, you know, this one thing is this ideal, but you also need to do this thing. And they are completely conflicting, and yet we're taught to just accept them uncritically and not really think about the consequences of it. And so it's one of those things where, you know, we have to do a lot of mental work to get past all of these things that we've been trained and, you know, educated throughout our whole lives to believe and to do. You know, there's a YouTuber I watch, Peter Coffin, who goes into the fact that all of this is kind of embedded within the larger concept of liberalism, and which here I'm using to mean kind of the idea that capitalism and markets and, you know, representative democracy and all of these things are, you know, not just good, but like how the world should be. And so, you know, you'll often... You know,
I hear a lot from people, that not necessarily like how it should be, but I hear them say like, it just is how it is. Like everyone knows that like markets just describe reality, and they just describe, you know, I have some friends that have fallen into like the libertarian trap, right? And they're like, which is where I started out my political journey, you know, like 15 years ago. But, you know, they just think like this is just this revelation. Like markets are like divine revelation that just describe human behavior and how it functions. And it's like, aren't you putting the cart before the horse a little bit? Like just because I don't know. Just...
No, and you're absolutely right. Like the market ideology is absolutely massive in how it kind of shapes our understanding of the world, because we're taught that, you know, the invisible hand of the market is the most fair and free system there is, and it ignores all of these external factors, like the fact that the more capital you have within a particular market, the more control you have over that market. And, you know, they're always, you know, ignore that and just say, oh, well, how are you going to gain all this and all of this capital within the market? It would just automatically even things out. And you ask them, how does it do that? And they can't give you a meaningful answer. Like, how do you prevent a massive accumulation of capital from being able to completely dominate a market? And we see that today. It's right in front of us. The fact that, small businesses can't survive when, something like a Walmart or a Target or something come in and suck up all their business, because economies of scale allow us to create massive numbers of things for massively cheaper than, artisanal products. And even like, a small mom and pop shop, they still buy things from a distributor just like everyone. But the fact that they're not buying as much, they can't get those gigantic bulk discounts that these giant warehouse stores can. And so they're paying more for the product, which means they have to sell the product for more just to, be able to make any money on it. And when you have this other store 5 blocks away that's selling it for 30% cheaper, you're going to buy it there because that's how markets work. And so they never kind of come to terms with the contradictions that exist within the ideology that they so strongly adhere to.
And agriculture, so like economies of scale is basically what destroyed agriculture. I'm a farmer, if I didn't say that at any point in this podcast, but economies of scale is basically what destroyed small farms, destroyed agriculture as we knew it in the United States, right? But we are now entering the stage, it happened in different segments of agriculture at different times. Like, it happened in the poultry industry in the 70s, it happened in the hog industry in the 90s, and it's just now starting to happen to the dairy industry. It's beyond economies of scale. It's to the point where if you are not of a certain size, you literally cannot buy things. Like, you cannot get service. You can't buy things, you can't get service, you cannot sell your product if you are not selling it in a full semi worth of whatever it is. And we are entering that in the dairy industry now. So that's like the step past, like, economies of scale are an advantage. It's past economies of scale are an advantage if you're not a certain size, you literally cannot play the game. Done. Bye. Gone.
And of course the people who trust in the market would say, oh, well, you just need to provide a better product. But if you are literally unable to buy the equipment needed to make the better product because it's so absurdly expensive that only these giant conglomerates can actually afford with any, ease, then it completely eliminates the point.
Right. And in agriculture, everything that we're doing is a commodity. Like, it is by definition a commodity. I cannot get a different price for my milk than the farmer down the street, no matter what we do differently, So, you've completely eliminated that option in agriculture, which I think is why agriculture accelerates so quickly towards these ends compared to some other industries, because we have so little ability to differentiate.
Oh, but what about organic? You could sell it as organic and get it for a premium.
Yeah.
Sarcasm heavily intended.
Are you trying to segue into my topic, which was?
I mean, I wasn't attempting to, but it's certainly a good way to do it. I mean, I felt like it kind of moved semi-naturally from one to the other until we got to agriculture, so why not?
Well, I have to say, I was a little nervous about my topic. If I was going to be this is a little too esoteric, this is a little too, extreme, but
honey,
you got it covered before I even started, so I think this will fit right in.
I started dropping names like Peter Kropotkin and Karl Marx halfway through my thing, so I think you're fine on the esoteric front.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's what I mean. It's perfect. So, I'm going to tell this in sort of the order that it happened to me. So this is I'm in the Midwest. I'm in Minnesota. I'm in a pretty conservative part of Minnesota. So Minnesota is a blue voting state, but just barely. And we actually did have in the before times a pretty strong rural rural Democrat movement. Like, that was our Democratic Party in the state of Minnesota is called the Democrat Farmer Labor Party. It is not called Democrats, it's called the DFL. So, like, there was historically, like, a very strong blue presence in the rural areas of Minnesota, even more so than many other places. But in many places in the U.S., that used to be the case 50 years ago, and it's just slowly dropped off. But I found it really interesting in all of my travels in agriculture to find how many organic farmers that I ran into, like most of the organic farmers that I interacted with, are actually extreme far-right people. They are extremely religious, and that's really what's driving their science denial, that's driving them towards organic. They are, by and large, climate deniers, climate change deniers, and a lot of them are like live off the land, prepper, homeschooling sort of types. And I've always thought that was just really odd, because it just seems so at odds with what everyone's perception of organic agriculture is and who the customer of all these farmers is. And this morning, an article came across my feed that said something about organic farming started in Nazi Germany. And I was like, that's really interesting. And I took a screenshot because I was milking cows, so I didn't have time to read it. And I came back in after chores and I started Googling. And I never actually found that original article, so I don't know what that said, but I learned so much about the sort of unholy alliance between natural food movements and this sort of mystical rural pastoralism, like, that was romanticized, and fascism in most of these countries. So if you think about the Nazi slogan, blood and soil, like that was literally about soil, like as in our homeland, like that was very important to them. And so basically in the mid to late 1800s, there was like this, among sort of the elites in Europe, there was this sort of romantic agrarian concept, right? Of like, oh, if we all just got back to the land and life would be so simple and it would be so lovely, and this is what makes a man is hard work. And it was sort of this whole thing. And then during World War I, so many of these countries experienced a lot of famine, which I think really shapes a lot of how people in North America think about food and food systems compared to people in Europe and the way our governments handle food systems. But that's probably a topic for another time. But we really have not experienced the kind of famine in the United States or in North America at all the way that they have in Europe. But during World War I, Germany was basically convinced that one of the big contributing factors to losing World War I was the fact that they starved. And so there was just some chance that some of the people involved in these like natural food movements in Germany were also sympathetic to Nazism, but the people leading the Nazi party really latched onto it because they saw it as a way to manipulate the populace's behavior around food and make sure that they had a better food supply. So one of the things they did was they cut off food imports because they didn't want to be relying on food imports. And that's actually one of the big reasons that Hitler was mostly vegetarian, because Germany imported most of their meat products at that time. So that's why he was encouraging the populace to be eating less meat. Like, they were trying to rely on things that like very specifically were grown in Germany, and it was all about staying local, right? And so it was just that these two ends sort of helped each other, you know? And you could get on the right wing, and in right-wing and religious movements in general, one of the big value drivers, and this has been shown in sort of like psychological studies and things, one of the big value drivers is the concept of purity. The concept of purity is really important. Like, you know, there's a few things when you sort of separate like left-leaning people and right-leaning people, like what are the things they identify? And there's like 3 or 4, and I just remember conservatives, it was like purity and loyalty and a couple other things. And I've been present in sort of local secular humanist movements where they said, yeah, so what you should do is you should lean on how much they love purity to get them on board with environmentalism. Well, it turns out that that's actually been a huge part of the environmental movement from the beginning. And the environmentalist movements all over the world have actually had a fairly constant struggle between a right-wing contingent and a left-wing contingent. It's just that the left-wing contingent of environmental movements has been much more dominant in the past 30 or 40 years. But when these movements take off into this sort of conspiracy theory land and mystical appeal to nature land, then it's really, really easy to just bump those people over a little bit onto distrusting all of science. And when you get them thinking about, oh, should we be scared of GMOs? Should we be scared of pesticides? It's actually really easy to get them, if they're really sort of having this heightened sense about purity and where things belong, they start thinking about racial purity. Like, this sounds like a weird leap, but there's been a lot of historical evidence that these movements were intertwined, and the green movements have had to fight really, really hard to keep fascism from dominating their spaces. And
it's funny because an idea I come across a lot in leftist spaces is the idea of having to fight eco-fascism, which is basically exactly what you're talking about. It's this combination of, the principles of ecology and preserving nature, but, it often gets very closely intertwined with, the idea of preserving the quote-unquote natural order of things.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, we often have to fight that because it's really easy for the kind of the sort of people who are drawn to these these ecological causes to get drawn into that particular mindset. There's a tendency in anarchism called anarcho-primitivism, and there are various related anti-civilization ideologies. And one of the things that you will find very frequently with these people is, when they're making a point, it's essentially a stone's throw away from a fascist talking point. And it's really, difficult to kind of make sure that you're not, getting close to that, when you have those sorts of ideologies. And I'm personally not an anti-civilization person, and I believe very strongly in kind of the fact that civilization overall has been a positive thing, especially when, you talk about, how we can help the disabled and the elderly and the sick, because, without civilization, without kind of the medical technologies that we have, a lot of those people are going to end up dying real quick. Yeah. So.
Well, and so here's where I'm going with it. I'm going less from the perspective of, these green movements have had to work really hard to keep out fascism. And this is what I'm really concerned about. And I think it was toyed with a little bit. I mean, so in the 70s, there were some Christian homesteading organizations that pushed really hard on basically organic agriculture, homesteading. And those people are very influential in the agriculture and the natural foods movements, right? And we saw some right-wing folks talk a little bit about this. There's a book out there called Crunchy Cons, meaning crunchy conservatives, that someone wrote in the 90s, or maybe it was the early 2000s, and it hasn't really caught on. And I think the moment that Donald Trump started espousing anti-vax views, the right wing started to realize what they had, and that cult of personality. And what I'm really, really concerned about is, I'm not concerned about the left wing keeping out the eco-fascists. I'm concerned that the right wing just figured out how to pull all those people onto a fascist ticket and away from us, because people are so weird about food. Like, it is so emotional for them. And the same with the vaccine movement, right? Like, people are so emotional. Like, is it really hard to imagine that a lot of these anti-vax folks are so rabidly anti-vax that matters a hell of a lot more to them than racial justice? I don't think that's hard to imagine at all. And I've seen that creeping through the right-wing Trump supporter stuff a little bit here and there, and I'm really worried that people in the Republican Party are going to figure out the opportunity that they have, and there is some historical precedent for when the Nazis in Germany united those types of people to their cause, is when that created the alliance that they needed to really cement their hold on power, you know, because they were pulling people from very diverse backgrounds now, uniting around some sort of singular fundamental concepts like that. And that really concerns me. Because I don't know how to fight that, right? Like, I don't, this concept of like purity and appeal to nature is just so nonsensical to me that, like, I don't even know how to I don't know how to talk someone out of that, right? Like, it's an emotional hold it has over people. And there's no like tagline that we can get to pull people back from that. And the bottom line is, I think a lot of these, you know, crunchy anti-vax people are a lot more emotionally attached to those ideas than they are to not being assholes to gay people, you know, which I don't know what else we have to draw them in, you know?
Yeah, it reminds me of a saying I see a lot, which is, I don't know how to explain to you that you should care about other people.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, I completely understand it, and like, I can think of 1,000 logical rebuttals to all of their arguments, but getting to the emotional center of it is the incredibly difficult part, because, I mean, yeah, you can argue against the idea of purity with the idea of biodiversity, and you can argue against, you know, the idea of vaccines are bad with actually no they're not, and here's why. And you can go into all of these fact-based explanations and these logical explanations, and they aren't going to do a lick of good if they're so emotionally invested in the idea that it has become part of their identity. And that is probably the most pervasive issue. And you know, that's not just on the right. It's, you know, it's pretty heavily on the left too. But in the case of, you know, the more dangerous element, this idea of they take these ideas and they internalize them until without them they don't know who they are. You know, if you were to suddenly strip them away, they would quite literally have an identity crisis. Because it's so embedded in their ideas of themselves and the stories they tell themselves about that.
I was just thinking, so remember how you were talking about how revelatory it was when you heard anarchism being a set of things that you do instead of an identity? Hmm? But maybe the reason these food-related and health-related concepts are so core to people's identity is because they're things that they are doing every single day. Like, every time they pick up a piece of food, they're thinking, I'm making this choice because these are my values about food, you know? And that's why it's so, like, I just feel like there's so many people that we could lose, you know, if the right wing goes all in on saying the right things to these people, because it just seems like that stuff matters so much more to them because it's so much closer to them, right?
And they feel like
These
they
things.
can, yeah, like you said, like they feel like it's a thing they're doing every day. I think that really, if they are out there shopping organic every day and they have decided that vaccines are no good, then in some sense we've already lost them, right? Like, I don't know how we could possibly stop them from becoming fascists.
Well, I mean, there are probably people out there that do just casually grab organic fruits because they read an article once somewhere, You know what I mean?
Yeah, you're right.
Or even just because the word organic makes it sound better.
Right. But there are people, and even when it comes to like the health thing and the anti-vax thing, I don't think most people are casually anti-vax. They are doing things on an almost daily basis in that same vein, right? Like they are taking a supplement, or they are, or, you know, following a diet or pretending to follow a diet, right? Like that they think is related somehow.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, it is really closely tied with identity of like health and fitness, and like it's actually the food organic industry is so tied to so many things about everybody's day-to-day life. It's
well, and for a long time, I mean, the only people ever talking badly about organic were like right-wing funded sort of deals, right? Yeah. Like that was very common. So that's what scares me, is like, so if they drop that and they start saying the right things to these people, like, I don't know what we have to, and you can see it if you go look up like voting records, like on some of these types of things. It is only the very most right-wing politicians uniting with the very most left-wing politicians on all this stuff, right? On this food-related stuff that I'm talking about, and this vaccine-related stuff. I mean, you get the Rand Pauls and stuff on those topics. So they're so close. It's right in front of them. And I feel like this purity stuff, like once you ignite this like purity culture, I don't know how you can extinguish it in people. Like once they distrust the food in front of them for some reason, because that sort of like fear response with this purity response, like human psychology is so weird. Like, how do you talk someone down? Like if I set a glass of water in front of you and I say like, don't worry, this water's definitely not poisoned. I can't get you to stop thinking about the fact that the water might be poisoned, right? Like once it's been brought up, there's no turning it off.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, yeah. Is that, I don't know what to say. It is concerning.
Yeah, like this is getting into subjects that are, that would be best, discussed and kind of informed by psychologists, because like, I'm sure there are ways to kind of get around that, and, whatever they are, they're clearly not obvious, because I think as activists, we've tried various tactics on a number of different people and have been, unsuccessful in a lot of cases. And, I've had my small share of successes in like converting people from a ridiculous ideology, in the fact that I once convinced a flat earther that maybe his idea was wrong. But, it's one of those things that's really, really hard to get through, because the other person has to be willing to go in and take a really critical look at their own biases. Mm-hmm. I was once talking with a libertarian who, who's very invested in the whole ownership and property idea. And like, I had to go all the way back to the very kind of origination of the concept of property and what it was, just to get him to see for a second that maybe this, this sacred cow that you hold so dear, maybe it's not actually something that you should be putting that much stock into. And, it's not easy to get people to see the kind of assumptions and biases they have. And so, I think a lot of it, and weirdly enough, to kind of parrot an old Christian talking point I heard, it's a lot about relationship, where you need to build up a sort of trust with the other person, and, before you can really get into topics that are going to challenge, who they are on a very core level. And
so
even
that's been a real tool for me in having these discussions online, is as soon as these right-wing people find out I'm a farmer, they immediately are interested in listening to me for a few minutes longer than they would to anybody else.
Right.
Like the second they find out I'm a farmer, they are willing to talk to me. And
honestly, I have wished more than once that I could say something like that and be like, I have personal experience, because often they will take personal experience and like direct interaction with the topic over kind of expert opinion
but
I
mean,
kind of
not even related to food topics. Like, I mean anything in politics. Like, anything in politics. If I say I'm a farmer, people on the right will listen to me. Right now, in this current era. Like, they will give me the time of day because the right has already started this rural push, right?
Yeah.
And it's to all these people that aren't even actually farmers, but farmer is somebody on their team to them. Even if you actually look at the demographics of farmers and the way they voted in the election, farmers voted for Trump at exactly the rate that all white males voted for Trump. Like Trump is not any more popular among farmers than he is among any other white guy. From all the data we have, which is admittedly
after
shitty
the last
data. But
3.5 years, I'm kind of hoping farmers are a little less inclined toward Trump, given the shit he's done.
I mean, I certainly saw that trend, but once COVID hit, it really probably erased that, because the rural areas were definitely in the camp of like, we don't have any cases in 100 miles of us. Why are we being affected by this? So like, honestly, COVID probably erased all that. But I was seeing a lot of people being anti-Trump pre-COVID in the farm circles.
Why don't I have anyone in 100 miles that has COVID? Because you have 5 people within 100 miles of you.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
So. Well, Corey, you probably want to get to your topic.
Well, I was just thinking I had a similar experience with the oil field. People listen to me a lot more because I live in an oil field area or oil industry area. So everybody assumes they think that you think the same as them. And you can kind of sometimes edge in a little bit of like pro-labor, pro-union stuff in there every now and then, as long as you don't use the word union.
Workers should, get together and
Yeah. And I had, I took my, my first aid and H2S courses here, 2 weeks ago. And there was an interesting cross with this, far right people who, only want to eat organic food and don't trust vaccines. And like my first aid instructor was actually, she's a pro oil person, but she's teaching a first aid course and doesn't really like trust vaccines per se, but she couldn't say she was anti-vax. And then we're talking about food, and she's talking about all the healing nature of honey and all this stuff about organic food. And yeah, it's conservatives here have embraced much of the organic food talk already. So
yep, it's been that way, basically the whole time.
Yeah. And to kind of use it to segue into my topic, she also mentioned in our H2S course that she thought Joe Biden was a pedophile, which is something that QAnon believes and has spread. So I guess for people who don't know, QAnon is a kind of little, well, not so little anymore, but a kind of a segment of the far right who essentially believes that there is a secret cabal of child eating, sex trafficking, pedophiles who, it's just so absurd to say, who are kind of hidden in different places. And there are people from Hollywood and the Democratic Party and liberals in general kind of support this pedophile, child eating thing. And They
there's a lot of like celebrities too. Like they have lists of celebrities that eat children to stay young or something.
Yeah, it's specifically Tom Hanks and Hillary Clinton are at the head of this.
Chrissy Teigen is also very involved.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, she's been harassed by just hundreds and hundreds of people on Twitter for the last few months.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, I knew like about the whole sex trafficking, ring accusations, but this is actually the first I'm hearing of eating children to stay young.
Yeah,
and like, oh my god,
it's something to do with the adrenochrome that is produced from the pituitary gland of a young child.
Sounds like a bunch of pseudoscientific bullshit to me.
Yeah, it's all complete nonsense, but they believe it quite firmly. And and that kind of crosses over with a lot of other far-right beliefs. I mean, they can incorporate all kinds of things into it, and they've been using the hashtag #SaveOurChildren so that they can argue that they're just fighting against child sex trafficking.
There was a conspiracy theory that came across my radar a couple of months ago via TikTok, of all things, where it was talking about Wayfair and the fact that they had these outrageously overpriced cabinets that just happened to have the names of, or that happened to have names that were the names of like children that had gone missing in various like ICE detention camps. And I'm suddenly curious if that was linked to this whole thing. Okay,
yeah, that's part of it because those children's names are like, that's why it's a $50,000 cabinet, right? Is because there's children in it being transported for trafficking purposes. So, there's also, I mean, it all kind of started with this person who labeled themselves as Q on a 4chan board. I think it was our poll or something, but I don't know for sure. And they occasionally will drop these hints as to what's going on with Trump and this fight against.
Well, they claim to be like in the White House. Didn't they?
Like it's a secret person who is
But they kept claiming all these things were going to happen, and like none of their predictions have come true. Like they kept claiming like such and such will be arrested for pedophilia, and like never happens. And it's been going on for years.
Yeah, and for some reason, they will cherry pick ones that they can manipulate the language around so that they can say that this prediction did come true. Trump did this thing, and then they'll ignore, like it's like any cherry picking, right? They'll ignore all the false ones.
It's the same way any like predictive confirmation comes true. I mean,
record the hits.
You can look at prophecies from the Bible to Nostradamus to fucking anyone, and you can find ways to interpret their words such that, oh yeah, like this thing totally happened. Hell, I remember a documentary I watched probably a decade ago at this point where people had taken segments of the Hebrew Bible and they had like lined up the characters in them in a specific grid form and looked for like lines and rows and diagonals with these certain words from these certain pages to use as like, oh, this is a prophecy that was hidden in the text. I'm just like, oh my God, you could not be reaching more. You could do this with literally any sufficiently linked text where if you just line up the characters in a certain way, you can find patterns that make it look like they had claimed that that the Bible predicted that Bush would defeat Gore, some 4,000 years before it happened. And I'm just like, are you flipping kidding me?
Yeah. Yeah, it's as the thing about QAnon right now is they've just had a series of rallies in the last few weeks that actually had quite a few people going to them, and they firmly believe that not only are the Democrats child eating pedophiles, but they also are like Marxist, socialist, whatever left-wing philosophy they can pretend to associate with them.
As a hard leftist myself, Joe Biden and his cohorts are nothing but center-right neoliberals.
Yeah, exactly. Please. Yeah, and the two articles that I have here, like one of them is an opinion piece. It's just titled, "We're not going to fact check our way out of QAnon," because people have tried to spread the facts and debunk the basic myths of QAnon, and it isn't making a dent. In fact, the movement is now on its way to electing its first representative that has openly been QAnon supporter. So I can't remember her name, but
yeah, she won a primary race in Florida.
Yeah,
as I remember.
And it's like
state,
a really red. Yeah, it's a red district. So yeah, I saw in Texas there were a couple attempted murders.
Oh yeah,
on the QAnon conspiracy theory. Yeah, a lady tried to kill some people with her car because she said they were pedophiles kidnapping someone, and it was just regular people. Like, it was multiple people. Like, the first one was just like a guy in a van. Like, he just owned a van and he was driving his van in a normal way.
Dare he own a van?
Yeah, and then and they like I read this article, it was so sad. Like, they interviewed this girl's friend, and her friend was like, I showed her the first QAnon video as a joke, like, so we could laugh at it together, and then all of a sudden she just decided it was real.
Yeah, I think I heard something.
She's been let out on bail.
Yeah.
She's been let out on bail, and she said she will not stop trying to kill pedophiles. So
yeah,
that's going to go well.
Yeah, it's much like there's a lot of stories now where family members are having to cut ties with QAnon supporting family members, or where QAnon supporting family members will cut ties with non-QAnon family. And like even parents with children and stuff like that. And it's every day, and it's getting quite concerning to me anyway. A lot of people.
I mean, you're not the only one. Like, I guess I hadn't realized kind of the extent to which the believers and supporters of this had started to kind of take things into their own hands. Like, I still thought it was, very much a fringe thing, and like the one, or the one person who won the race in Florida was, just a massive outlier. But I'm starting to see that this is a lot bigger than I realized that it was, and
I think
this is
definitely
since
something
lockdown,
it's really, really, really picked up steam since lockdown, like, and since COVID in general.
Yeah, I remember seeing a Twitter thread the other day where someone had thought they had evidence that a particular guy who runs like the 8chan forums was Q. And like,
there's not enough evidence to say for sure though. So
yeah, like when you first look at it, it looks mildly compelling because like the 8chan servers and the one of the websites that Q supposedly posts on were all at the same IP address. I'm like, that's just that's just someone being on the same hosting provider, not necessarily hard evidence. It definitely seems plausible enough that like this person who happens to own this rather large kind of counterculture message board would be behind this, and spreading all of these false rumors just to start this sort of giant conspiracy based unrest. It's not dissimilar to what people have accused the Russians of doing in the 2016 election. Not to say that that's false. I firmly believe that there was plenty of evidence to show that happened, but now
Q
everyone's
has certainly
looking
kept
for conspiracy
8chan
everywhere.
relevant. I mean, 8chan might not be nearly as relevant as they are now if it weren't for all this Q stuff.
Very true.
Yeah, it's I think somebody said that they kind of connected these dots. Like, this isn't a new discovery. This is a few months old at least. And it hasn't made any like who Q might be. Apparently, if it's a fraud, it doesn't. They'll just say that it's like the QAnon cult or group will just say that it's fake news as if it does into their branded belief system, right?
Right.
They are immune to facts. Or even if this was true, it isn't going to solve it. So I don't know.
Well, and I think there's been some question with the original Q stuff of, it was all just anonymous. So like it wasn't even necessarily one person. I mean, it was just an anonymous poster signing Q.
Could have been
so
anybody.
There is not really a point at which it's verifiably a single individual anyway. So I don't know. So this is just overall depressing and terrifying.
Yeah. Good start.
It's good. Good start.
It's a scary time we live in.
Mm-hmm. So now for the next 2 weeks, we're all going to go look at psychology and figure out how to get people to stop believing this stuff, right?
If only it were that simple.
Something that...
Or we could just get more depressing. That's fine too.
Well, hey, I might be able to find an article or two that brings some light and joy into the world. Yeah, I'm not counting on it, but maybe.
Just still on the Q thing, there has been like one of the millions of podcasts that are talking about Q right now. There was one that was talking about like deprogramming them in the same way that you would deprogram a cult member. And there's some discussion about whether or not that's more brutal or how abusive that can be sometimes, and whether or not that it's worth it to deprogram your family members out of this kind of cult belief system. And
how do you
usually have to
someone?
Like isolate them and then deplete them of like the things that will keep their critical thinking active. Like you kind of sleep deprivation and like you have to like make them live in a very...
Isn't this how you get people into cults?
It's the same.
I'm confused.
Yeah.
Isn't this how you get people into cults? You isolate them and then you make sure they can't do any critical thinking.
In order to deprogram them, it's very similar to how one programs them, and it's essentially targeted abuse. And like, it's on ethically shaky grounds, but it's one of those things of, well, if they've already been through this once to get them into the state of mind, if this is the only way to get them out of that state of mind,
isn't the right call.
The ends justify the means. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
So I don't have any particular way of closing this out except like I guess we could say where should people look for us? I guess we're going to be at skeptarchy.com. And my Twitter handle is @hardcoreskeptic.
And you can find me on Twitter at AncomScicom. That's ANCOMSCICOMM.
I have a Twitter that I don't use very much these days, but it's More Cowbell. MOARCOWBELLE. I don't know. Maybe I should use it more. It's just...
That's an amazing Twitter handle. You really should use it more.
It's pretty great. I agree. I mean, I used to use it a lot just to chat with friends, and, it's how I got, like, my current roommate / farm help and everything else. I just sort of fell off Twitter, like, after 2016 because I just sort of oversaturated on politics for a little bit there, and I never really got back into it. But you can also just find me on Facebook at Del on Earth, DELLONNERTH, because that's my Facebook profile that I use for all this kind of stuff. So, skepticism, atheism, all this podcasting stuff.
And hopefully we'll have a Facebook page and a Twitter account for the podcast eventually.
Yeah.
Cool.
We'll figure it out.
Well, thank you guys for joining me tonight. And
thank you.
Thank you to anybody who listens. Thank you very much. Yes.
Yes. Yeah,
okay.
I'm already recording because, you know.
Yes,
right,
I'm also
I'm recording now.
All right. So 1, 2, 3.
Okay.
Well,
try again. Yeah,
actually, your two were pretty well synchronized. So, like, there is going to be a delay.
See, that's funny. Kevin, mine and yours seemed really synchronized, but Corey's seemed really off to me.
Well, no, that's going to make sense. And then Corey will think he was synchronized with me, but yours will be off for him because it's going to take time for everybody's clap to get to everybody else. That's the whole point of the sync. So, like,
right,
the fact that your two were synchronized for me means that they should all be synchronized together.
Interesting.
Okay.
Wow.
So, yeah.
I guess we'll see.
Theory,
I believe you.
Yeah.
I don't know if I understand, but I believe you.
That's usually a good idea to believe me.
All right.